Hello. Oh, wow. All right, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. This is an event hosted by the Human Rights Student Advisory Board, which I'm on. My name is Dufier, and I'll be moderating the event, and I'm on the Student Advisory Board. Today, about 39 million people have been displaced due to conflict or natural disaster, and usually these people are victims of war and oppression. These people are forced to live in appalling conditions that lack adequate infrastructure and basic needs. And we at the Student Advisory Board realize that it's usually spoken about when hot topics occur, but people don't look at it in the global context. So this is why we created this platform. So I'm going to go ahead and let the speakers introduce themselves.
Go ahead. Okay. Hi, I'm Sarnada Reynolds. I work for Refugees International, which is based in Washington, D.C. It's an independent organization that researches and does advocacy around humanitarian response for people who are displaced or stateless. Sorry, should I go through all this?
Yeah.
Okay. I just got back from Malaysia and Thailand on Saturday, so I've been 2 weeks out there looking at this situation for Rohingya refugees. They are people from Burma, Myanmar, who have been denationalized. You might have seen them in the news, actually. In May and June, they were stuck on boats out in the Andaman Sea, so it became part of the bigger international story, which was important for them because they've been persecuted for more than 30 years, and very little of their experience has gotten out, and there's very little, fortunately, remedies for them right now. It's a population I've worked with for a long time and very committed to. Our organization, when I said it was independent, what I mean is that we don't take government or UN funding. And in our area of work, I think it's actually really important because humanitarian response is almost entirely funded by UN agencies who are funded through governments, primarily the US government. And so when there are problems inside of a response to the needs of refugees, or we look at internally displaced as well, or stateless people, organizations on the ground often don't have either they don't have the ability to speak out about what's happening because it might compromise their ability to provide humanitarian assistance, or they don't have the capacity or perhaps willingness because it could compromise their ability to secure more funding if they're going to criticize, for instance, a UN agency or the response of a donor government, like the US, a donor government. So we're able to come in and speak frankly to all kinds of actors, to UN, to the INGOs, international NGOs, community-based organizations, obviously the impacted people themselves, governments, and kind of get a really broad perspective on what's going on, and then have recommendations that are specific, policy recommendations that are specific, but also don't pull any punches, if you will, when we need to. And I really appreciate the ability to do that, because there are times that, in Myanmar, Burma, for example, where the government has a very, very strong hand on all UN agencies, all INGOs, and so it's a very difficult operating environment, and it's also an environment where there's a lot of abuse and no one's speaking out about it, so we can. I'm just looking here. Is there anything else you wanted me to cover right now in the introduction?
Right now, no.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
We're happy you came.
Good afternoon. My name is Anita Sinha. I am a practitioner in residence here at Washington College of Law. I co-teach the Immigrant Justice Clinic. Our clinic works on a variety of cases relating to the rights of indigent non-citizens, people coming from other countries who have not yet or are not citizens of the United States. And in doing so, we have, I will describe when we get into the substance of our talk, some of the work that we're currently doing with an INGO, International Non-Governmental Organization, trying to provide recommendations to European migrant rights lawyers on responding to the crisis in the region. I'll also talk a bit critically about the way we in the United States have responded to recent crises and the way that we worked in the clinic, specifically with the Central American women and children who have been coming in greater numbers the past couple of years to the U.S. and what that means for us, both as an American American immigrant rights lawyer, but also as a country in being a leader when these things happen globally, and sort of a little bit of frustration around that. And also, before coming to WCL, most immediately I had worked in the Gulf Coast doing post-Katrina work, and it is very important to me to also bring up domestic human rights issues and how there, if folks remember, there was a little bit of a controversy around, I think, some media outlets calling the displaced people refugees, and that's understandable, right? I mean, they were Americans. They were fleeing not just disaster, but also government action and inaction in certain places like New Orleans. But we did do a lot of work around, both in terms of our litigation, our advocacy, and our communication, talking about them as IDPs, as internally displaced persons, and using, the UN guiding principles on internal displacement in trying to get better government responses, social services, et cetera, for the lowest income people who were really left behind. So I have a perspective from that, but I will probably spend most of my time talking about our current work with the INGO and also some of the Central American refugee observations I have.
All right, thank you. I'm going to begin asking the panel questions, and if you have any brief questions that tie into what they're saying, feel free to ask them because we would like this to be also dynamic. What is the difference between a refugee and a migrant? And do you think that there's more empathy for migrants in Europe than there is in the US?
Okay. So from a legal standpoint, there is a difference between a refugee and a migrant. The 1951 UN Convention on the Rights of Refugees codified what a refugee is, and that was then adopted in 1980 in the U.S. in the U.S. Asylum law. And it's someone who is fleeing persecution based on some protected grounds that most people probably know. And so in that instance, we could think about a refugee as someone who's forced to leave the home country due to political, social, sometimes natural disaster reasons. Now, a migrant, on the other hand, is someone who is then subject to is not subject to international protections, but is subject to the country's just regular immigration laws. Technically supposed to be, and again, I have a little bit of issue, right? So it's supposed to be economic migrants is the most common idea of a migrant, someone who's seeking a better life. But, I do like to point out the problematic distinction between, sort of the forced nature of both. Obviously, war, killings, that sort of thing is forced, but it begs the question as to whether economic necessity isn't also forced, right, in terms of if you can't feed your family, if you can't feed your children. It's a migrant of forced and a different nature. So there is sort of a problematic distinction, I think, sometimes between the two. A refugee could be a migrant and essentially is a migrant because they're migrating, but a migrant is not necessarily a refugee. So that's sort of how the spheres kind of align. Do you have anything to add on that?
I would agree with you on I actually think what's happening in Mexico and Central America, a lot of that absolutely reflects the intention of the Refugee Convention, which was to provide protection to people who were being persecuted by state or non-state actors. At the time, the 5 protection grounds reflect obviously a moment in time, a historical moment in time after World War II. They have all the protection grounds as well as other parts of the Refugee Convention have been developed out, have been understood with a wider perspective, for instance, women, since the making of the convention. And, so it's I think it's important that that we know that the convention has some problems inherent to it because it's a reflection of a moment. But I think as advocates as well that we hopefully are also discussing how do we broaden our understanding of the convention's purposes to extend protection. And then in terms of a migrant, agree as well. there's Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers, and that's important. And it's mostly countries who produce migrants who have signed it. Not surprisingly, and not those who actually or receive migrants, whether sort of through a lawful or unlawful, or undocumented process or regular process. And I think the distinction can be difficult for people who fall between, but it also can be difficult for refugees. So, for instance, when I was in Malaysia, which does not recognize refugees at all, has no program, has no law. Everything that happens in there for refugees is done through the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR. And they have no work rights because there's no refugees. There's no official refugee rights. And so there's discussion now about they have a really robust migrant worker program, like sort of an intake program from a lot of different countries in the region that would probably benefit some of the refugees that are coming from those countries, but then they would fall under a migrant category, technically, for purposes of their domestic law, and may not be able to go to UNHCR anymore. So it's interesting sort of when you start looking at the nuts and bolts of protection for either population, there's a lot of gray.
Right, thank you. You mentioned the distinction between economic migrants and refugees of war. Do you think that there's more empathy for the former as compared to the latter?
I think so, and again, it's sort of a false line of empathy, but I think that when people think of economic migrants, they think of their own economy too. They think about sort of own jobs, right? And so, for example, a couple of years ago when a lot of states in the U.S. were having, extreme budget crises, immigrants became the scapegoats, even though it was not sort of factually correct that the immigrants were taking away jobs, were taking away social services, etc. But, places inevitably go through economic downturns, and an idea of an economic migrant coming for sort of prosperity in the other country can get those nerves, whereas there is some kind of empathy that could be drawn for someone who's coming from war, especially, I know we'll talk a little bit about the media, especially if there is attention brought about the particular conflict. I do want to answer your question, also piggyback off of Sornata's point about sort of Mexican and Central American refugees, because I mentioned that I do want to talk a bit about that, because I want to ground the U.S. and our own recent history and current evolving history with this sort of global crisis. And so if folks know or paid attention to, in 2013, there was numerically it wasn't that much of a surge, quote unquote, but there was a greater number of women and children who were with their mothers and also unaccompanied children from Central American countries like Honduras and El Salvador, who are experiencing extreme gang violence and sort of state inability or unwillingness to control that violence. And the way that the U.S. responded, so, we as advocates tried to call it refugees. And I think that this makes this distinction very clear, because the current administration, I think, really responded to the crisis as a migrant crisis, sort of ongoing, our neighboring countries, Mexico and all the other ones, sort of people just coming over for a better life, to get in our schools, the children. And it was just actually pretty remarkable to me. I consider myself very hardened at this point and cynical, having done the work for 15 years, but I was surprised myself. I mean, the administration really has continued to treat the crisis not as a humanitarian one, but in punitive terms. And so, for example, every refugee, woman and child, is subject to automatic detention. And so we have these detention facilities. We took our students last year from the clinic to Artesia, which is in the middle of nowhere, sort of a very cold, scary facility, which has since been shut down, operated by a private prison corporation. They now have been moved to this other facility called Dili, also owned by a private prison corporation. This one is in Texas, also in the middle of nowhere. And these children, they're infants. They have cribs in detention facilities. They have women and children who are fleeing gang violence but are being treated like migrants. And so the Obama administration has been sued for this treatment, and they've lost, specifically around the detention of children, but they haven't given up the fight. They continue to fight in courts, and they continue to keep the children detained. And so I get worried, sort of being optimistic about the difference, because, I don't know how much more clearly a 6-year-old who doesn't have a right to a lawyer, right? In the U.S. immigration system, nobody has a right to an attorney, including children, including the mentally incapacitated. And so you have pictures of 6-year-olds before judges alone with a teddy bear next to them. I mean, it's like heartbreaking. And we treat them like migrants in this country. And so I don't know if it's a matter of real experience of the people coming to this country. It seems to be more a matter of political economy in terms of how we categorize them, given what has been happening here in the country, in the U.S.
So I would just add to that it's really interesting piece of my work to see how refugees and people who are not considered refugees, whether they are or not, are received in different countries, and it's amazing how consistent the rhetoric around migrants is. I mean, it's toxic everywhere. I've never been to a country where it is not toxic. I mean, in Mexico, it is toxic against Central Americans. In Central America, there are toxic discussions about people being deported from the U.S. who they consider migrants, who weren't born in, for instance, in El Salvador, but are being deported with family members who came in the 80s or 90s. So it's very interesting how consistent, and even the language, in different languages, it's the same words. It's swarms. It's what do you call that? Floodgates.
Yeah.
And it's the same. Surge. It's of course it's in a different language, but it's the exact same words and sentiments. I think that's so interesting. I don't think any country. I think every country easily politicizes the situation of migration into their country. It's just such an easy thing to pick up for a politician. It's amazing how easy it is, and to run with it. And obviously we see that here as well. In terms of Europe's reception of refugees right now, for what's happening. It's been incredible to watch, right? It's just, I say, I'm about 15 years into my work as well, and, there's never been anything like this. And, Bill Freilich is a friend of mine. He's at Human Rights Watch, the head of the refugee program, and he's, 30 years in, and we were just talking about how there's just never, this is amazing to watch. Europe was terrible at first. Europe was letting people die in the water, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands of people. Germany now has done an amazing job of saying, okay, we're going to go ahead and do the right thing. And, they've said they'll bring in 800,000 to 1 million people. They will be asylum seekers. They will not necessarily get refugee protection. But a lot of them probably will, because they're coming from Syria and from Iraq and, countries that have sort of, clearly have underlying conflict and, protected grounds, if you will. But then other countries in Europe, like Hungary, are not doing well at all. And the fact is, though, a lot of it, like you said, Anita, a lot of it doesn't look that different than the U.S. border and what happens on the U.S. border every year. People die on the U.S. border trying to cross into the U.S. every year. They die in the desert. More than 100 people, hundreds of people. I did a report on, when I was at Amnesty International, I did a report on the U.S. Southwest border and sort of the how enforcement practices violated the human rights of people of color, basically, because whether they were citizens or not, there was a suspicion around them, not in like other parts of the country, but specific to the border and what that meant. And people knew, they knew people who had died in the desert. They knew people who were lost, had disappeared, and they'd never been heard from. And, there's a real responsibility there that the U.S. government has that it is also failing in. So it's interesting. It's hard to say one's better or worse. I think there are better and worse moments in each, whether Europe or here, and in other parts of the world, again. Southeast Asia, where it just was, there's a massive amount of boats that have gone out over the last year. More than 100,000 Rohingya people took to boats. I was just reflecting on this. While we were there, we were asking governments and UN agencies, and local community-based actors, as well as Rohingya people, are you doing contingency planning? You know, if the boats go out again, the boats will start going out again now. The monsoon season has died down, so the boats will start. Are you doing contingency planning for this? Are the governments meeting regionally to kind of talk about what happens when people go out in the water again and where they're going to go? Last year, every country said no, until finally Indonesia and Malaysia said, we'll take some for now, for a year. And I was reflecting that it was a really important discussion to have. Obviously, there's a great responsibility around the protection at sea and refugee protection. But in my head, I was thinking, geez, I should be saying the same thing, to Mexico and to the U.S. Are you doing contingency planning around the absolute foreshore, 100%, expectation that women and children from Central America and from Mexico too will be coming to the border seeking protection. Some will, be able to meet an enforcement officer and be detained and go through a process. Mm-hmm. Some won't. Some will get stuck in the desert or stuck somewhere in Mexico. But we're not having that discussion in the same way. Mm-hmm.
May I just add a little bit about the European context, and I definitely defer to Sarnata around the international work and the great work that you do. But in terms of what the clinic has worked on a bit in terms of the European context, we have an organizational client, PICUM, which is a platform for international cooperation on migrants. Go to their website. They're a great organization. They have a lot of resources. And they've asked our students to, this is hilarious given what we're talking about right now in terms of U.S. context, and I almost have to put on my serious face, but it is actually yielding a lot of results. They asked our students to take U.S. best case examples of how we treat migrants in removal proceedings in particular. So they're not even talking about sort of protection status. They're just trying to do the most sort of crisis management issue, which is countries sort of expelling migrants there, and they're seeing what protections we have in the U.S., which we do have some from writ of habeas corpus down to present to a group of migrant rights lawyers in Europe in December. And so one of the examples that my students have been able to find, which has to do with the sort of Central American, Mexican migration issues, we do have an interior repatriation initiative with Mexico. And so, for example, before this time, before the initiative was signed between the U.S. and the Mexican Ministry of Interior, we would just sort of throw people across the border into border towns in Mexico, even if they were from the interior, right? And so that they wouldn't have any money to get home, and they didn't obviously know the city, and they would be more susceptible to organized crime and other sort of problems that would render them victims or dead. So at least we do have an agreement with Mexico that we will take people back to the place in Mexico that they are from, as opposed to just throwing them across the border. So that's just one example of, sort of, again, I was like, oh my God, what best case examples are we going to be able to present in the U.S. to Europe? But it's an effort to get some kind of basic protections to access to justice and just, humanitarian treatment of migrants who are being expelled from European countries. The other thing I wanted to just mention quickly, and I don't know much about it, I just want to bring up my organizational client's perspective. So we were talking about just generally, right, there's this, EU directives and sort of EU-wide policy making, and then there's the individual countries. And it's not like the U.S. context where it's federal and state, right? It's different. Don't ask me any more than that, but I know it's different. But there's, in May, I think, the European Commission published the European Agenda on Migration, right? And so you can go to the website and find it. It's really interesting. It's not that long. It's only 20 pages. But I thought that the critique by PICUM is a very telling one of sort of certain frames. And so they feel like this is a migration management document, which it is. I mean, it doesn't make it a sort of a secret that it's a migration management document. But what it does is that it collapses refugee protection with border protection. Right? And that's sort of a dynamic that I want to just raise. I think we've been talking about it inherently. But thinking about sort of the tension between, protecting refugees and protecting these nation states protecting their own borders. And when you have a collapse of the two, inevitably, I think the refugee protection aspect of it gets lost. And so I just wanted to bring those particular issues up.
Oh, thank you. Our third speaker just joined us, so I would could you please go ahead and introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hi everyone, sorry for I had some miscommunication about the starting time of this panel, but I'm glad to be here. I'm glad that you're all here. I work with the Syrian Network for Human Rights. We work on human rights issues in Syria, and I'm originally Syrian American. My parents are both from Damascus, and many of my family members and my friends and their families now are all around the world trying to find a safe place to be. As you've all probably seen on TV for the past 4 years, and I'm sure the panelists have discussed in detail, but the Syrian crisis now is entering its 5th year in March. There are over 250,000 people who have been killed. That's probably a really low estimate, but that's the last number that the UN released many months ago was 220,000, and they've sort of stopped counting the increases in people who are being killed. The interesting thing about the refugee crisis, from my perspective, is that for as long as I can remember in this conflict, there has been a refugee crisis. There have been millions of people outside of Syria for a long time now, and this sort of sudden global reaction is really a result of a really sort of xenophobic, anti-migrant reaction in a lot of specifically European countries. I mean, Turkey has been hosting around 2 million Syrian refugees for quite a while. In Lebanon, 1 out of every 5 people, 1 out of every 4 people in the country is Syrian, and it's been that way for a couple years. In Jordan, the 3rd largest city in the whole country is a Syrian refugee camp called Zaatari camp. So suddenly, these refugees who had been in all these countries for quite a while decided that the conditions in these countries are really not good, and that the Syrian conflict seems to be nowhere close to reaching a final solution. So they decided, okay, let's go for somewhere that's actually going to keep us safe, where we can have our children be in schools and so on. So then they started getting in boats and going to Europe and so forth. And that's sort of when the refugee crisis that we know today began. But the refugee crisis has been there for years. And it's a refugee crisis which predominantly stems from the continuous aerial bombardment of Syrian villages, Syrian cities. I mean, and the only party in this conflict that has the capacity to do aerial bombardment is the Syrian government. So it's a really bleak situation where you have the Syrian government being the main party forcing the exodus of the Syrian people. Of course, I mean, there are now additional components which also result in continued refugee exodus. You have Isil, of course, and Isil is targeting Syrians from all backgrounds, specifically in Iraq, the Yazidi minority, in Syria, many of the Christian and Kurdish minorities were targeted by Isil. But actually, according to the numbers, I mean, Syrian Network for Human Rights documents every human rights violation in Syria, and the overwhelming majority of ISIL's victims have actually been Sunni, Arab, Muslim, and so people from all walks of life in Syria are fleeing because of ISIL. Now you also have U.S.-led coalition airstrikes, you have Russian airstrikes, and all of these different things have given Syrians the sort of bleak reality that this conflict isn't going away anytime soon. They're not going to be able to go back to their homes anytime soon, and that's really what sort of sparked the second wave of the refugee crisis, which is the like the second displacement into Europe. Specifically, I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the projects that we've done with Syrian refugees over the past. I worked with this U.S.-based Syrian NGO called Karam Foundation. We do some missions to the southern Turkish border, where we meet with refugee children, and we provide them with all kinds of innovative education for usually a week or two every few months. And there's also continuous programming for them at the various schools, but we try to bring experts from around the world to work with these children and really try to bring some expert knowledge about a wide array of different things. I'm going to be going there in November and working with students on workshops about democracy and trying to set up a student council for them and explain to them how to do this. But the point of this is when you really can engage with the refugees and provide them with the assistance that they need while they're still in Turkey, it provides them with less of a compulsion to go to Europe and seek asylum there. So if you can sort of try to provide them with the assistance while they're still near Syria and in the neighboring countries, you can do a lot to prevent them from having to get in these leaky boats that often capsize, and is a very dangerous trip. The other important thing to keep in mind here, which I really want to highlight, is the extremist element that people often talk about in the rhetoric about Syrian refugees. Often, well, these might be ISIS. Donald Trump said a couple days ago, a lot of people have said recently, some members of Congress, I mean, we provide statements in testimony in Congress, and some members of Congress still think that Syrian refugees might be ISIS, maybe. I mean, obviously there's a core problem with this, which is that most of these Syrian refugees are fleeing from ISIS, and that ISIS is actually coming from the United States and from European countries and going into Syria. It's not the other way around, where they're coming as refugees. Most of these people have U.S. the ones who have gone from the U.S., they have U.S. passports. They don't come through the refugee system. They have European passports. They don't go through those refugee systems on the boats and so on. So this is sort of a ridiculous notion, but the important thing to keep in mind is if we can provide Syrians with dignified life in Turkey or in Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, and these neighboring countries, if we can provide their kids with educations, then we will be doing a big countering violent extremism effort. I was in New York last week. We listened to President Obama at the General Assembly talk about countering violent extremism, and most of the countering violent extremism debate is always about who should we be bombing, where, and so on. But in reality, if we can do more to support refugees and provide them with education, that actually is probably the most important way to counter violent extremism. Unfortunately, I do know some Syrians that have become radicalized for a number of reasons. So I used to go, I still travel pretty regularly into the northern areas of Syria, and there are tons of IDP camps right along the border regions between Turkey and Syria, and they're right inside the inside the Syrian border, and they just can't get into Turkey for whatever reason. What happens is there are a lot of Saudi and sort of more religious clerics that are going into these camps, and they're talking to these kids, and they're telling them, school isn't important. You should be learning about religious law. You should be learning these things. And actually, one of the struggles that we face pretty regularly is we talk to these kids and we tell them you should go to school, and they're like, why should we go to school? There's nothing for us out there. I mean, even if we go to school, we're not going to have opportunities and so on. So there is this difficulty of getting the students to be in school. They are more commonly found begging in the streets, doing small jobs in shops and so forth. So that's why another one of our programs at Karam Foundation is to actually provide stipends to refugee and displaced families on the condition that they're sending their kids to schools and that they can show us that their kids are going to schools. And that's sort of one of the conditions for the stipend. So I'm sorry, I'm not entirely familiar with what the panel said before me, but hopefully that was a valuable addition, and if there's questions and so.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your contributions. You all have mentioned how toxic rhetoric has been used in the various countries that the refugees have been into. The media has been very sensationalized lately, especially with the Syrian toddler that was washed ashore. How do you think the media frames the crisis? What role do you think the media plays in the crisis? And this is to everyone in the panel.
First, that was great. Wait, sorry. That was great, thank you. In our work, which is looking at humanitarian response, we're seeing a lot of the same things that you're saying. I was in Turkey in March, I think, which 2 million registered, but probably up to 4 million Syrians there. And it's true, and you could see that not just there, but of course in neighboring countries. I was in Lebanon 2012. I did the first sort of look at the situation for Syrian refugees there, which there was no response at that time because everyone thought it was going to stop. And of course, people are going to move on. It's not a unique phenomenon even for the Syrian population. And it's a real failure of the international community because the countries, the neighboring countries, have been accepting, huge populations of people who needed protection and didn't and don't have the capacity to make sure that they can get into schools, to make sure that there's curriculum that benefits them. That for instance, in Turkey, it's in Turkish. It's not in Arabic, of course. So there's just a fundamental problem there. It just makes it hard. And they don't have the support they need from other donor countries. And so, not surprisingly, a lot of refugees now, mostly Syrians, but other countries too, are moving onward to Europe, which, if it had properly supported neighboring countries in the first place, there probably wouldn't be as many people doing that. So I just wanted to bolster that point. How does the media? I mean, just on that point, the media has a job to do, and their job, part of their job obviously is to package a story in a way that is digestible to people and makes them want to watch and follow the story. And it's not always an accurate story, and it's not necessarily good for refugees in a lot of locations. I'm actually going to talk about Rohingya again. I just got back from Malaysia, so. But when they were out in the sea, if people remember, that was May or June, so May and June, the media talked about it as a trafficking issue, that this was people being trafficked from Myanmar and Bangladesh to Malaysia and Indonesia. And it wasn't actually a trafficking issue for the most part. It was a smuggling issue that had, it was decades old, very well established. Huge amounts of, operations from the basic level, just like here in the Americas, local people who help connect people up with smugglers, who then connect them up to boats, a whole operation. And when the media portrayed it as trafficking, because, honestly, it was the most salacious, it allowed Myanmar to say, yeah, this is a trafficking issue. This isn't about persecution. This isn't about people fleeing for their lives. This is about people getting tricked into getting on these boats. And some of that happened, but not very much. And so it really played into the hands of Myanmar and continues to now. They just, as far as they're concerned, this is a trafficking issue. And Bangladesh did the same. So that's just an example of a downside. But obviously an upside, of course, is that, like what's happening now with Syrian refugees, hopefully, there's this spotlight leads to better responses for them, both in the neighboring countries, hopefully also an effort, a political will to try to do more to help Syrian people inside Syria in a lot of different ways. And obviously, I think it did help Europe Germany to do the right thing by refugees for now.
That's an important perspective, yes, and thank you for your amazing perspective as well. I guess, of course it depends on the media outlets we're talking about. I force myself once a week to watch some minutes of Fox News, right? And so there's obviously, there's obviously different media, and so I actually probably saw this on Jon Stewart or whatever it is now. No, it was John Oliver. I saw it on John Oliver, but it was a clip of a Fox News sort of media highlight of the refugee crisis, and folks saw it, but it was like these, scary Muslim men, sort of like chanting sort of "God is great" on a train, and it turns out that footage was from like 2007 or something. It had nothing to do with the current crisis, right? But the message is clear. These are scary sort of terrorists trying to invade Europe and the United States. So there's that media perspective. The response, so I'll talk about the U.S. for a second, right? Folks probably know that the Obama administration, probably due to a lot of pressure, some civilian, a lot of media, increased sort of the number of slots for refugees from Syria, but it's really petty. It's pathetic. It's 30,000 more 2017. And that is not taking into consideration all the security measures that process that's built into that process to prevent the Isil people from, sort of coming here as refugees. And so, I always have a little bit of a frustration, myself included. So when I saw the child on the shore, that amazing photo, I was so moved. I was trying to figure out what I can do, even as someone who does this work, and of course people around the country have been doing that. And the frustration is, I had one friend who's so incredible, and she's in international refugee work, and she compiled a whole list of the right organizations to donate to, right? So that always is a troubling aspect too, is when there becomes this sort of moment in time in the media, this picture that captures people's hearts and ultimately pockets, right? Where does that sort of lead to, right? So that's always a frustration to have. And then also, the Obama administration is stepping up and saying, yeah, we'll give you 30,000 more, which sounds like a lot until you find out it's until 2017, that it's nothing compared to what Germany's doing. And also there are so many security clearance stuff that it's just, an abomination, honestly. So I guess that's always what is in response to what the media do, in addition to what Sarnaka rightly pointed out, which is sometimes the nuances get lost in the media. And the last point is the right-wing media being particularly problematic.
So I think, we all agree probably. The media, it does have a job, but most of the times I think it doesn't do really a good justice for the conflict. I think from a Syrian perspective, most Syrians, obviously we were all touched by Aylan Kurdi, who is the 3-year-old boy who was washed ashore when his family drowned at sea, except for the father. And that's a tragedy, and it's a failure of the international community. But every day in Syria, there are 30, 40, 50 people being killed. There are over 11,000 children who have been killed in this conflict. And the overwhelming majority of those children that have been killed are from this, due to the indiscriminate shelling of the Syrian government. This has all been pretty well documented. So the question Syrians are asking is, why is the international community focusing on these children who are drowning, which is a symptom of the international community's failure to address the actual crisis? Why is the media focusing on these small side effects of what is really a world war in Syria? Today you have Iran, Russia, Syria on one side, and pretty much the rest of the world on the other side fighting in Syria, and the victims of this global war are Syrian civilians, and many of them are children. So this is what the Syrian perspective with regard to the media, if you want to talk specifically about the refugees, the media does some really crazy things sometimes. One minute it wants you to believe that these refugees are ISIS, and then the next minute it wants you to believe that they're all like upper class people because they have smartphones. I mean, you have to sort of make up your mind. Are these people crazy terrorists that probably don't use social media and don't do all these things, or are they like the wealthy people in Syria that are just trying to go country shopping and trying to get like a better life? So the media really just like plays on these different hysterical ideas, and it really is really tragic. I mean, because at the core of all of this, there is a real humanitarian crisis that, I mean, you have much more than half the population displaced now. And today we have maybe around 4 million refugees. That number is going to keep going up, and it's going to go up fast. Because, I talked to a lot of Syrians in the country. You have, out of a country that was originally around 20 million people, you have 12 million of them now who are out of their homes because of this conflict, because their homes have been destroyed, or because different parties have come into their villages, so they've had to leave their homes. Those Syrians now that I'm talking to, they're watching, they're like, okay, Russia now is entering, and this conflict is clearly, like, it just added like 2 years onto the length of this conflict. Some people were talking recently about a potential for peace talks. And actually, I was in Geneva in May. We met with the UN Special Envoy, de Mistura, and there was a lot of groundwork being done to bring different parties of this conflict together to have peace talks. And Russia's intervention really, puts aside any possibility for these parties to come together at this point. These are the things that Syrians, I think, wish the media was talking about more, politicians were talking about more, because the refugee crisis is going to continue to get worse and worse. There's nothing that the international community can do to stop the refugee crisis without tackling the political problem at the core of this whole conflict. And so I wish that, at least for us, we could do a better job maybe talking to the media and so on, so that the picture is relayed in a more accurate way.
All right, thank you. The next question, what obligations do you think states have towards migrants versus that of refugees, if there are any?
And we talked about that a little bit. So it's just in terms of the UN Convention on Refugees, and versus migrants. But I just want to highlight that I think the distinction is very difficult and false, and it becomes a political, sort of a politically hued distinction that determines which law gets applied to which communities or which person. I also want to highlight what Sarnatha said about earlier before you came about the sort of problems with the refugee sort of protections. And so we have fought for decades on, gender is not one of the protected groups, right? And so you have this sort of membership of a particular social group as a catch-all. Fifth category for asylum seekers, and that's when gender fits in. And it's very difficult to it's gotten a little bit better over the decades, but it's still difficult to prove in that structure certain experiences of women refugees. Sexual violence and is a weapon of war, and we understand it in some contexts when we maybe essentialize it or make it sort of sensationalist, but on a sort of normal level that is just sort of gender violence, it's sometimes hard to prove. And so that's just one point I really do want to highlight in terms of special populations of refugees and difficulty in getting them protection in U.S. and other countries.
I just wanted, at this point, the Refugee Convention provides specific protections for people who fall under it. But it doesn't mean that migrants don't have rights, and I think it's sort of, all the time, we wouldn't know that from what we hear and what we see and the mistreatment of people. But one of the most important rights, and it sounds like part of this project you're doing, that sounds really great in Europe, but everyone has the right to due process before deportation, before removal. The U.S. has gotten rid of a lot of the due process that once existed before 1996. But there is still, the U.S. still has some due process in its laws. It's incredibly important. A lot of countries don't. The U.S. is definitely not where it should be on this one. But every migrant has the right to due process before deportation. And obviously mass expulsions and arbitrary, deportations happen all over the world. And it's a different type of, it could be a different type of hearing than a refugee who might be in a removal proceeding but has the right to make a case for protection in whatever country they're in. Also, migrants have the right to health care in the country in which they're situated. And a lot of this is within the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers. That convention is a political document, just like all conventions and treaties, and so it does make some distinctions between someone who's, they call a regular or a documented migrant versus an irregular or an undocumented migrant, which is not necessarily good from a human rights perspective, but it's chock full of good stuff. Most countries are not adhering to it. But I think it's a really important document to go back to and be familiar with, because the rights exist even without being a refugee.
Thank you. We did talk a bit about how the media shapes public perception. What role do you think this does? How does this affect states' obligations?
Take a stab at it quickly. Just to say that the media is an incredible motivator for all kinds of actors, but particularly for states. I don't think that Germany would have said, okay, we're going to step up and do the right thing, or that other countries in Europe would do the same thing to some extent if the media wasn't showing these awful images of Syrians and other refugees crossing the water. That's also true with the Rohingya community in May and June. That migration, that passage was not new. There was nothing new about it. There was a particular circumstance in which the boats got stuck because Pound was cracking down traffickers and smugglers because it was worried about its ranking in the U.S. Trafficking in Persons report. That was all related, but it wasn't new. And again, I don't think Malaysia and Indonesia would have said, okay, we'll take 1,000 or 7,000 people if there hadn't been those images on the news every night for a few weeks. So, that's a really important role that it has, and it can be quite effective.
I agree.
Agreed.
Do you think that civil society has the power to affect the actions of states?
You have to believe, right? I'd love to be out of a job. I always tell that to my family because they still think I'm like somehow corporate or government, They were like, went to law school, I incurred all this debt, and I'm a social worker, what? So I like to sort of use the analogy of like, well, business is really good, right? I think that we must, as a civil society, care. Related to media, I guess. Because media is sort of more populist now, right? We think of media in the traditional sense as, AP or New York Times, sort of paper. But we have a lot of power in social media to affect change. All these leaders are on Twitter, right? And sort of the sort of other ways that we can actually affect. And so we do in some ways. It's a double-edged sword, right? Because social media, it's like if you like something or forward something, then you did something, right? Like that's not really, it frustrates me because get out on the streets, like go really do something. Go do what he's doing, right? But That said, if you are inclined to do nothing and at least you use social media, that's better than nothing. So I do feel like there is a more expanded, populist maybe use of civil society now, and that it's global, right? So like, obviously the Arab sort of spring helped really put that in the light, right? There is a sort of global way that even civil societies could be defined, right? Like, you know, we don't just think about it now as our sort of country or like town, but it could be defined in a global way. So I must believe that there is a role for us and that we do make change, and I believe that there's different, more sort of accessible and widespread ways that it could be used to affect change.
I mean, yeah, of course I agree. Civil society has an important role. Actually, every time we have various meetings, whether with members of Congress or people in the administration, they don't miss an opportunity to tell us that, well, people are saying X. And it's really difficult to come to terms with some of the things sometimes that our administration says, for example, that we're not going to be able to do anything to protect civilians in Syria because Americans are, the experience of Iraq and all these things, the Americans just don't want to be involved anywhere in the Middle East. We want to have less of a footprint. And so that's a result of civil society in this country not really mobilizing and understanding the conflict and understanding what the United States could do to put pressure on various parties to actually resolve the conflict. The same thing with the refugees. I mean, actually what you said about the 30,000 increase in the refugees, it's important to realize that that number isn't even just for Syrians. That is for all refugees. Yes. The only commitment that this government has made for Syrian refugees is to take 10,000 Syrian refugees next year. 10,000 out of 4 million. I mean, this is it's just embarrassing. I mean, the position of the United States is really awful, and it's partially a reflection of the fact that civil society isn't pushing for these things. So I hope that maybe different civil society groups can work together to create the sort of grassroots and real on-the-ground campaign that could get some of these different policymakers to shift their position. Because right now, I think the U.S. is really it's shameful how little this administration is doing. I mean, especially when you take into consideration the fact that destabilization of Iraq was the result of a U.S. policy, and much of what's going on in Syria is the result of a U.S. policy. And so for the U.S. not to at least take in refugees that are created by its policies in this region, I think is really shameful. And that's not even to take into consideration what you are saying, which is something that we hear all the time. I mean, 10,000 refugees are quote-unquote going to be allowed into the United States next year, but according to people that we talked to at the Department of Homeland Security, there's no way these 10,000 people can ever make it through the security procedures that the U.S. has in place for these refugees. So, I mean, there has to be a more active civil society, because the administration uses this against us all the time. And, I mean, we know to some extent it's not true, right? That the administration, when they want to do something without civil society, they go and do it. When they want an Iran deal, they go and do it. When they want to go into whatever kind of conflict, they can go ahead and do it. But for sure, there is a role for civil society to play where they could be stronger, and it would take away this extra additional excuse that the administration has not to do things.
Again, I agree with everything you're both saying. I was just thinking of the Iraqi refugee example. I worked on that in 2007, 2008, and 2009. And part of what we worked on was getting an increase in Iraqi refugees to be able to come to the U.S. And it was easier. I mean, I was just thinking about, you had brought up before too, just how does the media frame issues, but it's also how do we frame them as advocates, as civil society, because that frame was pretty easy, because obviously the U.S. had gone in, and there was a lot of U.S. soldiers and U.S. aid workers who had their interpreters and their taxi drivers and their the cleaner and the cooker who were being targeted and killed because of their association with the U.S. So it made it a very compelling case for bringing people into the United States from Iraq in a very specific. It was more specific than I wanted, but it was what we got. We did that with Senator Kennedy at the time. And we have to think, as civil society, we have to think about that. How are we framing these issues? Obviously, that was a unique situation in that it wasn't that, it was not that hard to say there's a moral obligation here. There's a moral obligation anyway, but we really have to think strategically about how do we frame it if we haven't, sort of captured the powers that be here or in other countries yet. Maybe we have a responsibility too among ourselves, including me, to think about our messaging and how is there a way to be more effective?
All right, thank you. We do have some time for some questions before the speakers give their closing remarks. So if anyone has any, perfect. Here we go.
I want to go back onto the trafficking issue. So are women or children who are trafficked, are they not considered refugees even if they're brought somewhere against their will? And obviously trafficking is another crisis. It's not something that's normal.
So I can start anyway. So no. So a person who's trafficked could still be a refugee. The Refugee Convention is prospective. It's a well-founded fear of persecution, and so many people who are trafficked have a well-founded fear of persecution. I work a lot with stateless people around the world. So there's about 11 million stateless people in the world, so have no nationality. They also have no documentation. And so they're very easy to traffic because they don't leave any paper trail, and there's no government that's interested in helping them because no government sees them as a citizen. So they almost certainly will have a well-founded fear of persecution to the country if they're returned to a country where they're already persecuted and have been made stateless. That's true of many women, children, and men too who are trafficked. Obviously, not just for sex trafficking, for labor trafficking, for all kinds of trafficking, but not always the case. There are trafficking conventions as well. They're very much mixed up in sort of law and order, law enforcement. They're not so much about the victim as they are about the criminal enterprise, and that's a problem. But so sometimes there's other protection for trafficked persons, and that's another category we haven't brought up so much is stateless people. Who there's also a statelessness convention, not widely claimed. But I've worked on legislation in the U.S. to recognize for people here who are stateless. There's probably about 5,000 to 7,000 people not born here, but who are stateless, to be able to who have not been able to present a viable refugee claim, to be able to regularize their status in the U.S. regardless. And that's something that might come up for Syrians as well. The reason I was in Turkey in March, I think, was because Syrian nationality law doesn't permit mothers to convey citizenship on their children if the children are born outside of Syria. And so now you have all these children, hundreds of thousands of children who have been born to Syrian moms and dads, but the dad's missing, or he's dead, or he's fighting, and so he's not recorded on the birth certificate, if there's even a birth certificate. And so those kids may end up, depending on what happens in the political, whenever it happens, there will be at some point, hopefully, reconciliation, a political transition. And if that's not part of it, what happens to all these children? Many of them could become stateless. So, all these issues intermix. Forced migration, refugees as well. It's all in play.
I just wanted to add one thing onto the stateless thing, really quickly. It's not just the Syrians that are born in all the refugee camps that don't have the fathers. There's, more than half of Syria, which is outside of the control of the Syrian government right now. And hundreds of thousands of children are being born there in Aleppo and Idlib. And even in the areas that are under the control of the Islamic State, there's Raqqa. These areas are all outside of control of the Syrian government, and the Syrian government isn't providing any kind of documents even to those people that are born within its territories, but that are outside of the control of the Syrian authorities. So there is a huge statelessness problem we deal with these problems all the time because these are children that you can get into schools and they can become refugees. And I would love to talk to you and defer to you maybe on how those people, if there's anything that can be provided to those people, because we actually don't know what to do with most of those cases. There are a lot of people that are in Syria that were refugees from other countries as well. And so Palestinian refugees, for example, that don't have documents, that were stateless while they were in Syria and now they're trying to go. So there's a whole host of issues related to the statelessness issue. I myself actually I'm not able to get Syrian documents anymore because the Syrian government officially classifies me as a terrorist because of the work that I do with humanitarian groups inside the country. Luckily, I have U.S. citizenship, so I don't have to worry about the fact that I can't get Syrian papers. But for a lot of Syrians, they can't get any kind of paper. Their kids can't get any kind of paper, so this is a huge problem.
All right, thank you. We have time for one more question.
One more. Maybe take a couple at a time.
A couple at a time, and then just all right. Start with you, sir.
Yeah.
I have a question, since I was hearing from you before. You were speaking about the way to tackle the crisis is to implement the educational system, whether to implement other force measure. And I was wondering if, from your perspective, this education boost should involve European countries, so we should involve a promotion of education structure for migrants or refugees that come from Syria, or instead should be an implementation of those policies in the Syrian territory. Thank you.
Next question.
Thank you. According to the international definitions, what status would have the people that is internationally placed by environmental factors like climate change? Because now there are many cases, and if we can say, or we can say this, we can define like climate refugees, and what kind of protection they have.
I think there was one more question, or
I'm just worried because when I look at the U.S. policy in Syria, it is really confusing because the part that they are arguing the rebels is not well. It is a bit conflicting in the sense that those moderate rebels cannot be well defined who are the moderates. The second part of it is that their focus is they want to oust Assad. Now the problem there is the ISIS. Is America fighting ISIS? Is fighting to oust Assad. Then you also have the refugee crisis. Look at it again. Then Russia is coming now. When you look at Assad has been there and has helped safeguard some of the cultural people there, protected their interests. He may not be the best that they have, but he has been there for a while, and he helped to protect the Christians, the Muslims. Most of the churches have been destroyed. Christians are suffering. There's a lot of influx of refugees and all those conflicts. Then the press is not doing a good job. When you watch Fox, you watch CNN, it is just talking about the issue that Assad has to leave. Assad has to leave. I think at this point, my opinion is it's better it's better to work with Assad to fight ISIS. Then they use a diplomatic means of him leaving power than just focusing on ousting him and bringing more guns, and the people are just confused.
No. Can I take the third one first?
yeah, we have 5 minutes.
And no, actually, I'll take the question that you asked about the education system. I think there are a lot of people who are experts on education. I'm not an expert on education, but there's definitely a huge role for governments, European and Western governments, to play and provide in bolstering education systems both inside Syria and in the refugee camps in the neighboring countries. In Lebanon, Syrian students are bullied. There's a huge problem, and so students don't go to school. In Turkey, as you shared, they don't speak Turkish, and so they're also being bullied in Turkey because they're not Turkish and so on. And so the Western countries really need to step in and be able to bolster the education systems in these neighboring countries, in addition to trying to work inside the country. Now, the question that you asked is my favorite question because it's really a policy question, and it really has a lot to do with the details of the conflict. So, as a Syrian, I have to fundamentally reject any kind of role of a government that has killed hundreds of thousands of people deliberately over the past 3 years. If you look at statistics, and one of the things that we do at Syrian Network for Human Rights is compile statistics of every single human rights violation. There are only two categories of human rights violations we're not able to document. That's when an ISIS soldier is killed. We don't know about it because we don't have lines of communication with ISIS. And when an Assad regime soldier is killed, we don't have that either because the Assad regime doesn't communicate. But in terms of civilians, we've documented over 185,000 civilians who have been killed in the past 4.5 years. Out of those 185,000 civilians, around 181,000 were killed by the Assad regime. ISIS has killed around 1%, the other opposition groups have killed about 1%, and Assad has killed 98%. And this isn't just a sort of byproduct of a civil war. This is actually a deliberate strategy by the Syrian government to kill civilians in order to create the scenario for Syrians that it's either death or submission to the dictatorship of the Assad regime, which is a government that's been for 40 years. The brutality has never been, it's never been as high as it is today, but this is a government that's been torturing its people, detaining them arbitrarily, broken numerous human rights conventions. It's one of the most flagrant violators of human rights law in the world. So to suggest that such a government could be a solution is really, it's an awful suggestion. Now, when you look at in Iraq how the Obama administration asked Maliki to step down because of the sectarian practices that Maliki was creating in Iraq. A large degree of the turmoil that we see in Iraq today is a result of Maliki's Maliki's sectarian policy. So first of all, they took all the Sunnis that were in Baghdad, they pushed them out of Baghdad. They took all of Saddam's former generals that were in the military, especially the Sunnis, they pushed them all out of the military. Those people eventually all went and joined ISIS. Okay? The same policy is happening in Syria today. The Assad regime and its deliberate collective punishment on civilians is the reason why we have ISIS in Syria. In 2011, Assad released 3 prominent Muslim extremists that were in prison, in Saydnaya prison. Their names are Zahran al-Lush, and one of them several of them are deputies of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in ISIS. And one of them created the Al-Qaeda affiliate, which is Nusra Group. So 3 prominent Islamist extremists, he released them from prison so that they would go and create the sort of binary that the regime has always claimed exists in Syria. So, to answer your question, as briefly as I can, the Assad regime has really been promoting from the very beginning a false binary. It's either ISIS or Assad. And the Assad regime has been doing whatever it can to, behind the scenes, support ISIS so that ISIS would be the only alternative left on the ground. There's a study done by IHS Janes in December of 2014 that shows that out of 182 1,000, and I think I'm wrong on that number, 1,800 counterterrorism operations done by the Assad regime. Only 6% of those targeted ISIS. I'm wrong on the number of counterterrorism operations, but only 6% of the Assad regime's counterterrorism operations target ISIS. The other 94% of Assad's counterterrorism operations target the moderate Syrian populations and rebels that could be a credible alternative to the regime. For the regime, the most dangerous thing possible is that there could be an alternative to the government. The regime knows that ISIS is not, the international community is not going to accept ISIS as an alternative to Assad.
Okay, I'm sorry to cut you short, but there's a class here now.
Okay.
Yeah, right now. So I'm sure we could sit here for hours and discuss because it's an amazing topic, but I'm sure the speakers will be available for a few minutes after if you have follow-up questions. But thank you so much for coming. Could we give them a round of applause, please? And also there's a human rights film series that's starting, so you can go to the front and on the table there are like cards so you can check them out. But thank you so much.